Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone from all over the world and in South Africa and Africa as well as globally. Thank you for joining us from different parts of the world. My name is Yolande Andrews, Key Populations Program Manager for NACOSA, and I'm very happy to welcome you to NACOSA's series of webinars hosted under the banner of the Amaqhawekazi Harm Reduction Project, supported by the VIV Healthcare Positive Action Program grant. Before we get started, I would like to alert you all that this webinar is available in French translation as well as in sign language. Please go to the interpretation icon on your sheet, and you are welcome to select the language that is preferred. You may select South African Sign Language, English, or French translation. Without further ado, just to introduce this webinar and NACOSA. NACOSA is a national networking organization. We work to build stronger, more equal, healthy, and safe communities free from HIV, TB, and GBV. We do this by strengthening community systems, mobilizing and managing resources, facilitating networking collaborations, providing and enabling access to services, and advocate learning and sharing collectively, like we are doing with this webinar supported. This is a timely conversation today, very relevant to the key populations, especially since we are now in World Hepatitis Month, where we know that criminalization pushes sex workers and people who use drugs underground away from HIV, TB, hepatitis, and STI prevention and treatment options. In fact, laws that punish drug use and sex work fuel the spread of disease, increase overdose risk, and prevent harm reduction uptake by sex workers, people who use drugs, and other key populations. The WHO, UNAIDS, UNODC, and the South African National Strategic Plan for HIV, TB, and STIs all recommend decriminalization to achieve public health goals. So we are very happy to have distinguished speakers that are going to be presenting lessons around how we can progress decriminalization for sex work, as well as decriminalization of drugs for personal use. So we want to introduce our first speaker, who unfortunately, due to the time difference, is unable to be with us physically. But Isabel Pere from Colombia has been kind enough to send us a video around learning from Colombia around decriminalization of drug use, particularly lessons for South Africa. Colombia has taken progressive steps on drug policy and partially recognized sex work under certain labor frameworks. And so there are definite lessons that we can learn from their experiences since 1990s. So Isabel Pereira Arana is the Senior Coordinator for Drug Policy at Judicia and has consulted for organizations like the Global Commission on Drug Policy. Additionally, she is a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network and a fellow of the Aspen Institute of Colombia. So we welcome this video. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I am Isabel Pereira, and I will be presenting on the Colombian experience. I apologize I can't join you at the time of the webinar, but the time difference makes it a bit complicated. So, and I thank the organizers for allowing me to share this video intervention. I will be speaking on the experience of Colombia with regards to drug decriminalization. I work at a human rights NGO in Colombia called the Justicia. We do national-based work in a number of human rights areas, including drug policy, where I direct the drug policy area. And I'll be sharing the experience of drug decriminalization with what's been positive about it, but also what are the current tensions and risks that you may want to look ahead for your own processes in South Africa. So going back, we celebrated last year 30 years of decriminalization in Colombia. This came through a court ruling that was adopted in 1994. Before that, our national narcotics bill, that is a 1986 bill that is still relevant today, that bill introduced sanctions that were arrests that could be extended up to 1 year, economic fines, and the possibilities of forced internment for personal drug use. When the court review the articles in this law, they declare them all unconstitutional because they violate personal autonomy and contradict the liberal state model of the political constitution that was just adopted in 1991 at the time. So, of course, forced medical internment openly violates the freedom of autonomy enshrined in the Constitution, and they were declared unconstitutional. So, this decision gave a twist to the concept of the personal dose. The personal dose was a concept that already was there in the 1986 bill that differentiates or basically defines the thresholds by which the quantity that a person carries can be defined for their personal use. That's why the name is personal dose. So it's 20 grams for cannabis and 1 gram for cocaine. It is undefined for a number of substances, which makes it very complicated. But through the Constitutional Court ruling, they also embedded that this personal dose is a tool to distinguish between a person doing illicit activity, which is personal using drugs, and an illicit one, which would be drug trafficking. So then, once again, all of the arguments behind decriminalization in Colombia are through individual autonomy and personal freedoms, not so much as a collective or in terms of what it could do for public safety. It was always based on the fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Constitution. In the years following and even up till now, there have been decades of tensions around decriminalization and, of course, multiple attempts to reverse the decision. The most significant was a constitutional reform proposed by the administration back in 2009 by the president to reform Article 49 of the Constitution, which is an article in which all public health and the right to health is enshrined in the Constitution. What they wanted to do was to reintroduce criminalization and criminal sanctions for personal drug use. What they managed to do was to introduce prohibition of drugs at the constitutional level. So now prohibition is in Article 49 of the Constitution, which is a problem. First, because we have prohibition at a constitutional level, it also becomes a barrier to work in some other areas, for example, towards legal regulation. But since it is within an article that regulates the right to health and public health, it also allowed for the expansion of harm reduction services, or even for harm reduction services themselves to defend and justify that they can operate, because prohibition allows for services for the people who use drugs as part of their right to health. So in a way, it was a step backwards in a way, but a step forwards in some other ways. Then when the Constitutional Court reviewed this reform and declared it constitutional, that's why we have it still standing today, they did determine that although prohibition was introduced in the Constitution, this by no means was a reintroduction of criminalization of possession and personal use of drugs. So we are at a very confusing status where we have this prohibition at a constitutional level of substances declared illicit, all drugs, but we have still the decriminalization model under a prohibition, constitutional prohibition. It is confusing, but it is where we are. A second tension that has come about is around the issue of thresholds. And we can even now say that the thresholds no longer exist, although they do legally, and they still have huge effects on people who use drugs, but they have been contested many times over, even by legal systems. So because thresholds have this are very risky in terms that people can carrying drugs for their personal use can be prosecuted if they carry a quantity that is ever so slightly over the amount that is legally allowed. What has happened is that unfair penalties have been imposed on such cases. So there was one emblematic case where a soldier who was transferred to a very remote location outside of a major city, he was caught with 50 grams of cannabis. So the personal dose for cannabis is 20 grams. So he was above the amount, but it was not like a trafficking amount. And he was prosecuted as if he were a major drug trafficker. This case was reviewed by the Supreme Court in 2008. And although it did exceed the legal limits, The court concluded that it was not an illegal activity because it wasn't proven that he was intended to commercialize the substance, but that rather it was for his personal dose. So what the court developed was a concept that is now very common, which is the concept of the supply dose, which is basically the person purchases in bulk quantities that are greater than the personal dose in order to supply for use for several occasions. And the court concluded that this conduct does not constitute a criminal offense. Also, that the key to establish whether a crime was committed or not was to prove the intention to commercialize or distribute. But the issue with the thresholds is that police usually don't do the work of proving that there was an intent to commercialize. Then the other concept that was introduced to challenge the thresholds and the personal dose is the concept of the shared dose. It was by a case that reached the Supreme Court of Justice in 2023 for review, a case where a woman had introduced drugs to a prison for the intimate partner visit to share with her intimate partner. And the court clarified that when carrying drugs for the purpose of sharing them with one or more people with whom one has a close relationship and there is a free exchange and a horizontal act between two adults or more adults, it is not a crime. So what the court developed was this concept of the shared dose. The problem with these challenges that have been posed, even from within legal systems, to the personal dose is that cases need to reach the criminal prosecution phase even to get debunked by concepts that have been issued by legal systems. So people still face the penalties, even though courts have declared that certain conducts cannot be automatically associated with a criminal offense. Thirdly, another tension around decriminalization, and one that is the more relevant one today, is the transition from, yes, we have decriminalization and there are no criminal sanctions either for possession or use, but there are administrative sanctions that were introduced in 2016 by the police code. The police code introduced at least 15 or 20 articles in which possession, simple possession, and use in public spaces, specifically use close to churches or schools or parks, so basically a lot of spaces in cities, are sanctioned with fines that amount to almost half of a monthly minimum wage, which is a lot of money, and seizing of the substance. Even though the norms were declared unconstitutional by our constitutional court in 2009, the Congress reintroduced the same norms as if nothing had happened. And then in 2023, the Constitutional Court reviewed again some of these norms and made several determinations that while they upheld the decriminalization model, specifically for possession, they got us into where we are now with a full mess of complications. So regarding possession, the court clarified that possession itself cannot be sanctioned because it is a private and constitutionally protected act and conduct. And it's positive that this was reiterated once again. Possession itself cannot be sanctioned even with administrative sanctions. But the not so positive thing was that the court concluded that the current rules, while they're not proportional, the strange bit was that then they said to maintain the restrictions on drug use specifically in public spaces, under the condition that municipal authorities, so mayors and local congresses, must set the conditions. So basically make their own regulations into when, how, at what time, in which places can people use or not use drugs in public spaces. And what has happened in the aftermath has been a full-on confusion, because it's of course a very, very politicized thing, and local authorities, specifically in very conservative cities, have taken this opportunity to almost criminalize and kick people who use drugs outside of the public space. So the regulations have been a clear setback. To date, 48 decrees that have been issued of the ones that we've studied, 17 of them are blatantly unconstitutional, just for the mere fact of, one, that they introduce sanctions for simple possession, and once again, the Constitutional Court has said that this cannot be sanctioned. And two, they introduce general prohibitions. So, for example, 24-hour prohibitions. And the court has said that this cannot be the case. This has always also imposed a great conflict between the police and people who use drugs in public spaces, and the imposing of fines from the data that has been gathered has been sanctioned in situations where people are carrying the personal dose. So even the personal dose is being fined and seized. Sorry. The conclusions for where we stand right now is, although our decriminalization model was a very early victory back in 1994, of course it is not sufficient, and there is a great risk when it's not, when it's combined with administrative sanctions. So we live in a decriminalization world that is still criminalized via other types of sanctions. We're trying to get to a place where the decrees can be declared unconstitutional, but there are more than like 50 or 70 of them, and the cities continue to issue them. So I think the more pressing thing is how to reform the police code in itself, because it is what is becoming a source of problems. And then the issue of thresholds is also very problematic, where people have to go through the criminal system even to get their processes declared non-valid, but they still go through very lengthy criminal processes and even to jail. So we have a lot of documents and materials of this, but of course they're most in Spanish. In any case, feel free to contact me if any of you have any questions. I'll be happy to talk over email or just solve any questions that may happen during the webinar. And I wish you the best during the discussions that you will be having today. Thank you so much, and hi from Bogota.
Thanks. Thank you so much all for listening into that video. We do know that it is a little bit more difficult when the speaker is not available to answer questions. But we are very, very fortunate to have someone who I consider a strong advocate for decriminalization, not only for drugs for personal use, but also for sex work, that has been an advocate pushing harm reduction within this country. We have Charity Monering. Charity is the executive director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy International, spearheading global youth-centered drug policy reform. Her work champions harm reduction, human rights, and evidence-based approaches focusing on empowering young people and advocating for policies that prioritize health. Charity from the Students for Sensible Drug Policy International has graciously agreed to field any questions related to this video that was shared on lessons around decriminalization of drug use in Colombia. And then we are also going to move forward thereafter with any other particular points or questions. So Charity, you are welcome to join us for the Q&A session.
Thanks, Yolanda. Hi, everyone.
Thanks, Charity. Still have a serious girl boss fan obsession with you. So thanks so much. You joined us in our last webinar where particularly you were talking about harm reduction services for young key populations. And today, you know, your expertise around decriminalization is so critical. I know that you are particularly involved in a committee that's pushing forward conversations around visioning, you know, why we want and need, you know, a decriminalization for drug use. So I noticed one question in the chat, and then perhaps that you can support on, which is, what has been the impact on public health of decriminalization of personal drug use experience in Colombia? So I think that's a really interesting question, Charity. I do want to make a point, though, from Isabel's video, is that, yes, the conversation is about public health, but really it's about autonomy. It's really about the individual's right to choose. So over to you, Charity.
Thank you so much, Yolan, and great question. Thank you so much, Sophie. So I think Colombia presents like a really interesting example of decrim, and thank you so much for including Colombia, because I think in a lot of decrim conversations, we mostly focus on global North experiences. So it's really nice to have like a global South country with a very similar context to South Africa in terms of social, economic issues. So, as I said, Colombia is very unique in that decrim for them wasn't just about stopping people from getting arrested. They included integrated services. So by moving away from people getting arrested, they invested in harm reduction, which is built into the public health policy. So what is different with Colombia is that they have a lot of cocaine use. And so their harm reduction looks very different to what we do. So we mostly focus on like injecting drug use, whereas their harm reduction is more focused on like inhalants. So cocaine is inhaled, a lot of harm reduction around smoking drugs. And so they have safe smoking kits, they have supervised consumption spaces, and these are all mostly community-based. And I think that's what makes it really a great model, because they've invested and made sure that services are implemented by communities, by peers. They've engaged with traditional and indigenous knowledge. They have a huge indigenous community in Colombia. And one of the other things that they included in their decrim model was to also pay reparations or recognize the coca growing communities within Colombia. So exploring how regulation rather than criminalization could benefit coca farmers. So they've really integrated this holistic decrim model where it's not just focused on use, but also the cultivation of cocaine or coca. And also a narrative change, essentially, where they've shifted away from like the war on drugs to rather life with dignity. So it's more on, like you've mentioned, autonomy, making sure that people are able to make decisions on their own, making sure that it was a holistic legal process. And I think the beauty of Colombia is that a lot of the advocates there are actually lawyers, which is quite different from us in the drug policy space, where we have a lot of policy experts. Like, I mean, I myself am a policy expert, even though I have some legal background, but I'm not a lawyer. So they have a huge legal fraternity that is working on these issues, which is something that we need to start exploring and looking into, is really trying to get more legal practitioners involved in this process so that we are aware and in like on top of things when it comes to any legal discussions. So I think it's been really, they have shown quite a bit of successes, but there are still challenges. And Isabel mentioned them, how shifts or changes in presidents or governments have tried to push back, but because it was a constitutional judgment and constitutional exercise, it has still remained, it's still quite relevant. I mean, since the 90s, they've been doing this for quite some time. So there have been some positive public health improvements with some challenges.
Thanks so much, Charity. I'm just giving an opportunity. I mean, I could talk to you all day. I got a list of questions, but let's see if there's perhaps any hands up from the audience or the attendees. So let's give it a minute to check if there's any hands. So I noticed Terence's question, but Terence's question is more about, from Sisonke. So we do have a presentation from Zintle from Sisonke. So we'll wait for that opportunity there. Okay, I'm not noting any hands, so that's just the perfect opportunity for me. But I think the one thing, Charity, that I found really important, and I think it's related a lot to the sex work decrim conversation, is this idea of administrative penalties. These sanctions, municipal sanctions and bylaws, and the municipality's authority around this. It is very concerning. I know that was something particularly that Zintle will probably talk to later around sex work decrim challenges. But it seems to me that though there's constitutional laws around this, there's still a lot of autonomy given to municipalities or to districts around how they operationalize that ruling.
So yeah, decrim is not a one size fits all. There's different forms of decrim. So there's de facto decrim, which is not legal changes, and then there's de jure decrim, which means that the law has to change. Um, and I think that's the challenge that a lot of countries experience. I mean, in the US, you have specific states that have decriminalized cannabis use, and yet federally it's still a crime, for example. And so yeah, I think it's really just a matter of trying to tailor make or identifying key stakeholders within respective communities. So I mean, we could go as far as working with traditional leaders, for example, who have authority to dictate what happens in their communities, and they actually can have things can actually happen. So they could literally implement like a de facto decrim on their own, where people are not getting arrested for drug use, but are rather finding more community-based approaches to it. So I think one of the things that we don't prioritize and invest in South Africa is a lot of community-based work. So community-focused initiatives where we don't have to rely on government to fix society. So we need more investment in peer-led initiatives and community-based initiatives because people are from communities. And when they get arrested, they come back into those communities. So if the community itself is not capacitated to address the needs of the community, then we're going to still have municipal laws and bylaws that still ensure that people are getting arrested for being on the streets, for example. Whereas if there was a community approach, there would be safe spaces for people that traditional leaders have maybe allocated for people to go to, like havens for abused women, for example, or people who are homeless. So we really need to start looking at how we can shift away from relying on government to address social issues, but rather look at like key stakeholders and individuals and institutions that can really help push our agenda and really look out for our communities. Because yeah, in law, I mean, politicians work on public, I guess, popularity. And if the community is educated, then communities can really push back on bylaws that don't make sense and really deteriorate their own communities.
Thanks, Charity. I mean, and a great response to that, and very true. And as I said, reflective of other decriminalization conversations. I notice a hand from Mohammed Matala. So, Mohammed, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Thanks, Charity. I mean, in the decrim sort of understanding, I know in South Africa, there's a thread to be drawn between colonialism and colonial rules around controlling people, movement of people, trade, income, even in the decrim of sex work. So I was wondering in Colombia, if also there is that link between these laws that decriminalize some things, that criminalize some things and other things are okay, whether there was a link to that in Colombia as well.
So I'm not too sure, but I do know that they've decriminalized sex work. But I mean, Colombia, like I said, they have a great model that is a great example for the global South. However, they are still themselves are still battling with US enforced drug controls. So yeah, I mean that's my limited knowledge, but I do know that they are still grappling with a lot of influence from the US. The politicians are still quite influenced, same way that we are in specific areas. So I think they still, fighting against the colonial impact or influence within their countries. But I do know that for drug use and sex work, they have managed to decriminalize that. I'm not too sure about the other aspects as well, other social issues.
Thank you so much, Charity. I think it's you, Mohammed. You're welcome to put the question in the chat, and we'll forward it to Isabel, who was our speaker in the previous presentation video, who was more than helpful to give us some clarity. Charity, we've run out of time, but I do want to note Terence's very good question. Terence has asked, may you kindly share effective community and peer-led mobilization strategies that also work effectively in advocating at parliamentary and police development level. I think Isabel in her video said very clearly, policing coding needs to be changed in Colombia to see effect of the constitutional ruling. So your opinion, Charity, to Terence's question?
So I guess one of the things that we struggle with is that we're stuck in the middle of having activists and more activists than advocates. So advocacy it needs to be very strategic. So peer-led mobilization could be around like capacitating people on what avenues they can go to. So for example, Parliament, for example, is open to the public, but not a lot of people know that they can actually just go to Parliament, attend meetings and actually talk to politicians or parliamentarians. In terms of police developmental levels, there have been trainings that have been done with police, but the problem with the police is that it's a very hierarchical system. So when you think that you've got it right, to have like peers engaging with the police, you'll find that you're just engaging with a unit that doesn't even do visible policing. So you would have like the EPW unit that's very open to being capacitated on harm reduction, how to work with sex workers, and yet visible policing are still very punitive and so forth. So I think it's a matter, we really need to look at how to capacitate all levels of law enforcement, capacitating all levels of parliament, politicians. But I think most importantly, we need to start re-looking at our approach to advocating and start working with community level, because politicians, like I said, operate on public popularity. And if communities themselves and peers are educated themselves on their rights and what could benefit them, then there's definitely going to be a push against policing that is violating people's rights, laws and policies that violate people's rights. So I think we need to really look at how we can integrate or look at how we can address community, capacitating our communities essentially. And more community-focused advocacy than the national, and trying to speak to all these high-level people.
Thank you so much, Charity. And that perfectly sums it up. Even Isabel and the lessons from Colombia has indicated that ongoing anti-stigma efforts are essential to work alongside legal reform. So your point is very clear and we appreciate it. Thank you again, Charity, for coordinating and facilitating this Q&A session. Greatly appreciated, and we look forward to future engagements with you on this. Please put down your details in the chat if anybody would like to reach out to you to be more involved and raise their voice for decriminalization of drugs for personal use in South Africa. We're now moving on to the next section, and before we have our next speaker that will be talking about decriminalization of sex work, the journey that South Africa has embarked on for a long time, we want to introduce the space with a video that was commissioned by NACOSA through the Global Fund grant. It's a human rights video focusing specifically on the decriminalization of sex work, discussion and challenges and focal areas. And we do have this video playing right now before we move on to the next speaker.
Into ebanga ukuthi ngize la ngisuke ngathola umntwana, mangithola umntwana ekhaya bathi ngeke basangiphindisele esikoleni sengimdala. Angizama ukuthi ngihambe ngiyosebenza, ngayeka isikole, ngabuya ngeza la eJoburg. Mangifika la ngamaketha ngathola umsebenzi anguthola, mangawuthola umsebenzi ngathola abangani bangitshela indlela yokwenza imali easy. There's so many challenges I faced, and sometimes you'd get clients that are very rude, who would like because they don't want to pay. Like I have a scar here where one traveling car school driver because they sit about for the night and so it's no nzima, but obviously
the brutality I faced was a client which stabbed me in my leg here and my leg here.
Kuthe ngelinye ilanga kuyi-Friday afika amaphoyisa bengime neclient yami ebehamba ngemoto iclient yakhona ngisebhizi ngisakhuluma naye sakhuluma indaba ze-prize ukuthi uzonginikeza malini sithe sisakhuluma kanjalo afika amaphoyisa ngabaleka nami ngangena kuyona imoto yeclient basigijimisa nalo iclient kwaze kwaba sekutheni ngiyalimala ngilimele lonke isayidi leli laka left enyaweni anginaso isithende ngasuka isithende la ngine operation nginezimbe ezu2 engalweni.
So male sex workers, sometimes it's difficult for them to declare that I'm a male sex worker and I've got violated by a female client, because we do have a female who also kind of like abuse male sex workers because of the same vulnerability that happening to female sex workers. It also occurs on male sex workers. When these issues have been reported, the police officers do not make a joke out of it.
We need to be protected in all levels, in the sense that if I get raped, I can't open a case because of discrimination and stigma. Ay kwakunzima leso sikhathi ke wabona into yenzeke ungazi ukuthi uzobikela bani.
When we found out this song, it was 2003. The work that we do within the organization, we advocate for the rights of sex workers.
We are implementing programs for the protection of sex workers' human rights and law reform. So we're advocating for the full decriminalization of sex work, because criminalization on its own is a human rights violation.
The punitive laws, the criminalization itself in the country, it does actually become a barrier, for sex workers to access even the government facilities.
And now for us to achieve the universal health coverage, which declares by 2030, we need to end HIV. And criminalization of sex work is a health barrier in terms of HIV, in terms of accessing condoms.
In order to achieve our goals in reducing HIV, TB, and STIs for sex workers, in reducing gender-based violence, we have to get sex work decriminalized. It's written, it's there in writing.
Decriminalization would mean a lot to me, to my fellow sisters. They will be able to get access to healthcare, access when they go to the police stations to open the case, access to home affairs. Mina ngicabanga ukuthi lo msebenzi obesemthethweni kungaba ngcono ngoba bangabi nale nto leyo ukuthi mabe kubona lapha uyi-sex worker kunabanye abantu. Nginjena nje ngumama, ngu-auntie, ngusisi, ngikho konke. And isisonke ngithanda ngoba ayijudge umuntu. Ukuthi wena ubani noma ubuya kuphi noma unjani uyabona.
Because now it's decriminalized, so there will be the law that they are not supposed to arrest us. Because now we are also just like any other person who is working, who is going to work.
Sex workers are there because they are human beings at the end of the day. Before you become a sex worker, you are a human being.
Sorry, I can see from the chat the emotions after watching that video. Once again, just a warm appreciation to Sisonke, the National Movement for Sex Workers, who partnered with NACOSA in the production of that video and took the time to really explore the emotional impact, not only for female sex workers, but also for male sex workers in terms of how this can reduce gender-based violence, post-violence care access, healthcare access. So thank you again. We have Zintle Solwana from Sisonke National Movement for Sex Workers. She's the advocacy officer there, where she champions the decriminalization of sex work and advances sexual reproductive health and human rights. She's passionate about social justice, African feminism, and advocating for gender equality. Her particular presentation or discussion today will be on the call for sex work decriminalization in South Africa. Thank you so much, Zintle. Over to you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Yolan. And good morning. Oh, sorry, it's not morning. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, so my name is Zintle Cholwana, and I'm just going to be just outlining the journey of decriminalizing sex work, particularly in South Africa, because I think it's a very interesting case in terms of the beautiful constitution that we have in South Africa, but also comparing it to how it is not being implemented. So yes, we're going to unpack a lot of that. And I think as I'm going through this presentation, I'd like everybody here to, especially those that do not work with sex workers directly, I'd like you to think about, have you meaningfully engaged with a sex worker? If yes, what kind of support would you give for sex workers? And if not, why have you not engaged with a sex worker? So that's just something that I'd like you to just keep in mind as I go through this presentation. All right, so next slide, please. Okay, so where are we right now in terms of the sex work laws? So there are two pieces of national legislature where sex work is fully criminalized. So this is the Sexual Offences Act of 1957, which was called the Immorality Act. And there's also the Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Act in 2007. What was interesting here was that in 1957, there were three main things that were criminalized. It was sex work, same-sex relationships, and interracial relationships. Come 1994, because of the wonderful constitution, it was agreed that interracial relationships and same-sex relationships would be decriminalized because it is unconstitutional. But sex work remained there because clearly, according to some interpretations, that the Constitution, sex workers are not protected under the Constitution. The South African law currently does not care about sex workers. However, when we look at how the law is implemented day to day on the ground, it is usually the bylaws that are being used to unfairly target sex workers. And beyond that, it is street-based sex workers in particular that are unfairly targeted by these bylaws. So some examples, if you can see here, is soliciting, public indecency, loitering, and vagrancy. Thank you very much. So what are the effects of criminalization? Criminalization affects every single aspect of sex workers' lives. We do not have any protection or little protection of health and human rights. The stigma and discrimination that we experience from our communities can lead to being excluded from our communities. It can also lead to violence from communities. And so sex workers and also human rights defenders. So our work is also in danger because we are also at risk of being targeted by the communities. Gender-based violence in particular, when we are, yes, I will share the recording. Yes, so gender-based violence, there's a huge link between criminalizing sex work and gender-based violence. So much so that the Gender-Based Strategic Plan, which was published, specifically outlines that decriminalizing sex work in order to address gender-based violence. So that's already one example of a policy, an official policy, that states that decriminalizing sex work is an important part in order for us to eradicate gender-based violence. But we still haven't seen that, and I will unpack why later on. There is a disempowerment and limited agency. We do not have a lot of control over our bodies under criminalization. There's so many risks of violence that we have to encounter that we are scared to live our lives we are often scared to express ourselves the way that we want. And if you think about it, sex workers, as the video says, is that before I become a sex worker, I'm a human being first. So that's something to think about. Vulnerability to violence, that's also something that I've also touched on, and also economic disempowerment and exploitation. I would also like to add, though, is that the work that we've been doing at Sisonke for so many years has been able to address in the best way that we can to address those issues. Notably, the sensitization program that we have with police, and also the great relationship that we have with religious leaders. Over here, this is a quote that we have that I've taken from Izwi Lethu, which is our newsletter. And I just want to read it out for you guys. I wasn't going to waste my time going to the police. Why should I? After they were the ones who came to our spots and burnt our belongings, accusing us of being criminals and dirtying the city. I don't trust the police. This quote in particular is a reflection not only of the distrust of the police, but it is a failure of the justice system. It is the failure of the current laws where sex workers have to face this kind of violence and to get to a point where we cannot exercise our rights to health and human rights. Nobody deserves to be in this kind of space. Nobody deserves to be in this kind of mental space, regardless of the work that they do. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the big one. What do we mean when we talk about legalization and decriminalization? So there is a big difference. And the key difference here is in terms of regulations. Legalization in particular. Legalization is used in a way where lawmakers can say that, well, sex work is legalized, so you're allowed to work, but it's under very, very strict regulations. And those regulations can still be used to unfairly target sex workers. Now, if we think about Colombia, for example, Colombia is actually an example of legalization and not decriminalization. Why am I saying this? Is that in Colombia, sex workers, okay, so before I get into Colombia, when we talk about decrim, I'd like us just to think about three main actors or within sex work. I'll call them actors. So we have sex workers, which is the person that sells the sexual service. There's the client who buys the service, and then there's the brothel keeper who provides a space for the business to happen. So when we look at the laws, it's those three main aspects that the law looks at. Now with legalization can take different forms. So it can take different forms in different countries. But I want to focus on Colombia, for example. In Colombia, sex work, right? So the selling of sex is legal. However, brothel keeping is illegal, which means that we, as sex workers, they are not allowed to create a safe space for sex workers in a group to work safely. So here you can see that although you can say sex work is legalized, however, these regulations are still unfairly used against sex workers. Another example would be the red light district in Amsterdam. That is another example where regulations are used unfairly to define where sex workers can work and the times when we can work. So you see how, yes, the regulations are there, but it's still used unfairly and it is still a violation of sex workers' human rights. Decriminalization, and we like to say full decriminalization. Full decriminalization is the only human rights-based approach to sex work. Fully decriminalizing sex work means that selling the service, buying the service, and brothel keeping will all be decriminalized. And with decriminalization, it doesn't mean that anything goes, right? What it does mean is that the sex work industry will also be able to be regulated according to the existing laws in the country. This includes labor laws. This includes human trafficking laws. A lot of people will say that if you decriminalize sex work, then you allow for human trafficking to happen. That's not the case. In order to address human trafficking, the existing laws have to be implemented the way that they are supposed to. That's what a lot of people who are anti-sex work tend to forget, is that there is a law for anti-trafficking. But let's think about collectively, how do we ensure that this law is implemented the way that it wants, the way that it is supposed to? And I think another great example of decriminalization, and I'd like everybody after this to just do a bit of research and just look at New Zealand and how New Zealand has implemented decriminalization. A key there is that the law reform process, sex workers were actively involved in every part of the law reform process. Legalization does not include sex workers in the process, but decriminalization meaningfully includes sex workers in the process. Next slide, please. So why are we calling for decriminalization? So as I said, that decriminalization is the only human rights-based approach that we have in terms of protecting sex workers' rights, and not only sex workers, but the general community in general. We have to be honest, sex work is one of the oldest professions, and sex work is part of our communities. It has been like that for generations. So if we think about decriminalization, and how it would benefit, it doesn't only benefit sex workers, but the overall community. It's about empowerment and agency. So to be able to use my work and the money that I make for my work, and to be proud of the work that I do, because I know that it is recognized as a form of legal work and recognized work. Legal protection. That's also a major, major problem under the current system. Under the current system, we are not able to open cases in the police station. Oftentimes, they are not taken seriously. Oftentimes, because we are marginalized, because of criminalization, we are more vulnerable to violence. If you remember the Sifiso Mkhwanazi case last year, a serial killer who was able to target sex workers, 6 sex workers, he was able to do this because he knew that because of criminalization, every sex worker that he violates will not be able to go to the police, because under the law, they are criminals themselves. So that is a case of the devastating effects of criminalization. Next slide, please. Okay, so where are we right now in terms of decriminalizing sex work? Very briefly, there was a bill that was developed in 2022, and this went out for public comments. So when the comments were submitted, and I think in the Q&A session, I'm going to address the question that was posed earlier about the public submissions. But just very briefly, what happened was that the public comments were submitted to DOJ. They had analyzed them, and then the bill was taken to the state law advisor. State law advisor then says that the current bill, which was a very simple bill, because that bill was calling for the sections that criminalize sex work to be removed. That's all it said at that point. Then it was rejected because it does not pass the constitutional muster, because it does not have a framework for regulations. Now, what we are saying is that decriminalize us first, then we can start the process of regulating. But I guess that interpretation wasn't shared. Since then, we have been lobbying for the Department of Justice to include us in the redrafting process. They have promised us that they are going to conduct consultations, but we are still waiting for a response from the DOJ, but we will continue to put that pressure on them. Next slide, please. So, what do we need from everyone, our partners and our allies? For our existing partners and allies, we are so grateful for the work that we've been able to do. For us to get to this point, there's no way we could have done this alone. But what do we need? Continued support from civil society. Through civil society work, we were able to include decriminalization of sex work into the National Strategic Sex Workers HIV, TB, and STI plan. We're the only country in the world that has a specific health policy addressing the health issues around sex work. Secondly, we need to work, especially with grassroots organizations in communities, to educate everybody in the law reform process and the different legal models of sex work. The third one, collaborating with health, legal, and social service providers. Now, this also has been a problem because of the funding cuts from PEPFAR. So the number of organizations that we can work with has definitely shrinked, but we will continue to work with them. It's very crucial in the work that we do. Religious leaders. I'm very proud of the fact that we have been able to work with Sanarela, a religious leaders organization, in order to address the stigma and discrimination within our communities, because religious leaders are very influential in those communities. And the last one, research towards advocacy, evidence-based advocacy. So this is where we need our researchers, data collection. There's a huge gap in terms of data collection, and that feeds into our evidence-based advocacy, so that when we go to the Department of Justice, when we go to Parliament, then we can show that we are not saying just words. Here is the evidence to back us up. Next slide, please. All right, and there it is. This is a picture that shows the power of solidarity of sex workers. As a movement, we will continue on our mission and our vision. But what we need is we need everybody's support in our fights for decriminalizing sex work, because it doesn't affect just us, it affects all of us as a community. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sinclair. I think you put it beautifully there, that it's not just about, the sex work conversation or the sex work community. We need to consider intersectionality as well. There are men that have sex with men. There are young people who are engaged in sex work. There are, the lesbian community as well that are engaged. So there's a lot of conversations with people who use drugs. So it's not just about how does decrim affect sex work. It is also the paving towards legal reform in other aspects of our constitution and our rights. I noted a hand from Angela McBride. Angela, you are welcome. Please unmute. Angela McBride, you are welcome. We might be having technical difficulties there. So I think we'll move on to some of the questions in the chat. I think you actually spoke very well to the question of why not legalization, why we want full decriminalization because of the punitive approach. And even you mentioned examples in Colombia and other countries, but also in relation to, municipal bylaws that give them autonomy because things are regulated or things are legalized as opposed to full decriminalization. So I think, Sinclair, we can move forward from that because I think you made it very clear. I think the one particular question, unfortunately, Angela's saying that she's unable to unmute. Perhaps you can type a question in there. I think the one question was around, apologies, I'm looking, how would, for instance, decriminalization of sex work be co-regulated with, for instance, existing minimum wage law? Quite a big question there. I think it's a very important question when you talked about economic empowerment earlier. Please go ahead, Simply.
All right. So these are the kinds of questions that really need to be unpacked in a major consultative process. And that is what we have been really lobbying the Department of Justice to do. However, it's a very interesting question because when we do workshops with sex workers themselves, because at the end of the day, sex workers are the most important voice in this conversation, in the law reform process. So I would always pose a question to say, okay, would you prefer to work under a brothel that would be an official recognized place of employment where there are also labor regulations that would be able to apply there, such as minimum wage, or would you prefer to work as a freelancer? And the question is always 50-50. So this means that sex work, if you're going to look at labor regulations, has to be regulated in a way where the industry is going to be flexible. So if there is a brothel that operates as an official organization, like any organization, they would have to comply with labor laws. This also would include minimum wage as well. So, but there should also still be a space for sex workers who want to work as freelancers. A lot of online sex workers are already working as freelancers. And I do want to also highlight that the effects of criminalization do not really affect online sex workers the way that it affects street-based sex workers. There are different kinds of sex work, and criminalization affects them in different ways. I hope that kind of answers the question, but I am willing to engage further with everybody if they do have any further questions.
Thanks, Zintle. There is one more question we will allow, but I also want to note, and perhaps you could share details in the chat. There was one particular point made around, expansion and coverage within the rural areas around how they can get involved in the Sisonke national movement, advocacy. And then also Terence, I think, also mentioned about what is the capacity building opportunities so that we can build our capacity as voices for the decrim conversation. So you're welcome to make any notes in terms of yourselves as Sisonke, but also as your sister or mother, may I say, of Sweat as well. If there's opportunities to engage further. Angela, are you able to unmute at this stage so that we may... I'm going to ask you to unmute. I hope that helps. Perfect. Angela, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Yolande, and thanks, Sinclair and Charity and everyone. This has been so incredible. My quick question to Sinclair in particular, I know that for people who use drugs in South Africa, we're on this mission and this adventure and very much have been leaning on the incredible work that yourselves and Sisonke and the sex work movement have been doing. And I'm just wondering if you have any key lessons learned or any key suggestions that you could give us on our journey to kind of, if there's any speed bumps that you notice, whoops, this is what we should avoid. If you could possibly put some of those forward. And thank you so much, Nakosa and everyone for organizing this. It's so lovely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angela. Over to you, Zintle.
All right. Thank you so much, Angie. It's lovely to hear from you again. All right. So key lessons that we've learned. Decrim, it's been an incredibly long journey. But in order for us to get to the point of being able to draft a bill for public comments, we did need buy-in from the Department of Justice. And that takes a lot of lobbying in terms of DOJ. So the first thing I would say is that lobbying the Department of Justice is also very crucial in order to get to a point of submitting a bill and starting that law reform process. And also part of that in the lobbying is evidence-based advocacy. So in the lobbying, as much data, evidence that you can collect, also showing international examples of successful decriminalization of drug use is also very important. Once you then start the law reform process, so how it happens with the public comments, we had no idea when this was happening, is that the Department of Justice will look at the number of submissions and not really the content of those submissions. And this was a very hard lesson that we had to learn, because when it came to the numbers, anti-decrim had more numbers than us as pro-decrim. However, if you look at the content of those submissions, we had submissions from international organizations. We had submissions from researchers as well. We had submissions from the health aspect. So honestly, if you were to look at the content, then you could say that we had a much better case for decrim. However, purely because of the numbers, then it was interpreted as majority of the population is anti-decrim. So what I would then say is that when it comes to the second round of submissions, we have to get those numbers up, because that is what counts at the end of the day. Another thing is that in terms of the regulatory framework, it should be very clear, even as you are lobbying the Department of Justice, because it was that lack of regulatory framework that took us backwards. So that's also something in that to consider. So I would put those three as the top lessons.
So Sinclair, if nothing else, this has told me that we need to have more discussions like this. We need to be doing more webinars like this. People need to understand where we went wrong, how we can strengthen it. And as we said before, it's not just about the sex work conversation. So thank you so much again, Sinclair. I have indicated that further information and capacity building to reach out to Sesonke and to Sweat for further support. And thank you once again for also your collaboration on the human rights video that showcase the challenges and opportunities for decriminalization of sex work. Colleagues, we are going to move on to our last speaker, who I'm very excited about. But please note, in the chat, we will have a poll, 4 questions around your support of decriminalization for sex work and your support for decriminalization of drugs for personal use. We ask you to please, put into the poll your options so that we can have a clear understanding of where the direction is and the level of support towards this critical journey for decriminalization in our country. I am now going to move on to our next speaker from Lawyers for Human Rights. We have Nabila Meyer, who will be talking around drivers to progress decriminalization of drug use and sex work in South Africa. We noted a particular nice article that came up, I think, in HIV Nursing Matters that talked about what has been the delays in the decriminalization of sex work. And I think Nabila Meyer's particular presentation will be a critical component. Nabila Meyer is a human rights advocate dedicated to social justice and protecting disempowered individuals. She leads the Penal Reform and Detention Monitoring Program at Lawyers for Human Rights, addressing decriminalization, torture prevention, and detention alternatives. Welcome, Nabila.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present here in front of some much more learned colleagues than I. What I'll really be doing during my presentation is looking at, for the most part, the legal drivers really around decriminalization and considerations for driving decriminalization of sex work and drug use in South Africa. Briefly, a bit about my organization. I come from Lawyers for Human Rights, and we've been around since 1979, and really issues of detention and protection of those deprived of their liberty and affected by the criminal justice system, or I like to actually take the word justice out of criminal justice and say the criminal system, because really what we see is a system that that doesn't provide any justice, especially to those that are affected because of their poverty and status. And what we look to do through our work is really to uphold the fundamental rights of all persons vulnerable to and deprived of their liberty, including those affected by the increased criminalization of poverty, status, and migration. Now, in terms of this discussion around decriminalization, it's really important to contextualize decriminalization versus regulation or legislation, and why is this actually important for us in the work that we do. Something that the previous speaker went into really well was about these different concepts, being that decriminalization is about the removal of criminal penalties, but it doesn't necessarily lead to legalization or regulation. And sometimes legislation of something or regulation of issues can end up leaving some people out of the protection of the law. So that's why in these conversations and these movements around decriminalization, we have to include all levels of players. So the lawmakers have to include your policymakers, your public health experts, your criminal experts, and most importantly, centering people with the lived experiences at the center of these movements. Now, what we're seeing, and I think it was mentioned previously, is that outside of the conversation of drug use and sex work, decriminalization is actually happening in various spheres in South Africa. So we're looking at decriminalization of poverty, where there is case law that exists that attacks a lot of bylaws in municipalities that criminalize life-sustaining public actions of unhoused persons. And so that's really, the bylaws that you see, that you're not allowed to sleep on public benches, you're not allowed to wash your clothes in public. There's a strong movement around making sure that those bylaws are attacked and seen for what they really are. And we see more and more that where there has been progress is around decriminalization of sex work and drug use. So the current status, again, not to repeat a lot of what I said previously, but we know that still sex work is still criminalized in South Africa, but there are movements towards decriminalization. And while cannabis for private use was decriminalized in 2018 by the Constitutional Court, and you had legislation in the form of the Cannabis for Private Purposes Act signed into law that provided a legal framework for personal use and cultivation in private use of other drugs really still remains illegal. And on top of that, within that very act around cannabis for private purposes, there are still actions that are criminalized. So looking at the cannabis for private use that was decriminalized, the decriminalization is still very much to a limited extent, and it's only for cannabis, while use of other drugs and addiction in and of itself is still criminalized. Now, it's important when we're looking at these conversations and having these conversations around decriminalization, especially around drug use and sex works, is that we have to look at what has happened on the global level, because the global has influenced our laws. So the war on drugs, for example, was something that is a colonial import that was transplanted in South Africa. And in the article that Yolan mentioned, we really do go into the history of how that war on drugs found its way into South Africa. But what we know is that it's failed to reduce drug use or supplies or assist the people who are affected by it, but instead fueled really organized crime and violence and still burdened criminal systems. Now, what has become increasingly recognized is that your international drug control regimes, they've been exposed for the biases that they come from, the colonial biases that they come from. And so you've really seen movements from global organizations like the UNODC and the OHCHR more and more releasing viewpoints that the use of the criminal system is disproportionate for individual drug-related offenses. In fact, they do more harm criminalizing drug use than they do to benefit people. And there's been more and more an increase on a global level advocating for decriminalization of drug use and possession on for personal purposes. And then again, as the previous speaker went into, which is why I didn't go into this, as I knew our colleagues at Sisonke would cover this quite well, is that we know that sex work itself has been decriminalized across various jurisdictions, and it's really driven by human rights and public health arguments. And there are different models of decriminalization that, again, I'm not the expert on, and colleagues on the score have spent their lives' work really devoting to looking at what models are appropriate. And if you look at the case that's current where decriminalization of sex work is being considered, you'll even see there that experts have differing perspectives on what models should be adopted in South Africa. Now, moving on to the next slide. Sorry, that would be the 5th slide. So again, while we look at decriminalization globally, the African region has really seen an uptick on the decriminalization movement outside of drug use and sex work, but not outside, but very broadly, essentially really focusing on the criminalization of poverty and status across the continent. You've seen an attacking and an identification and an attacking of colonial era laws, specifically vagrancy laws that unfairly target poor and marginalized persons. And so you'll see that in South Africa, as I mentioned before, you could see that they found in our bylaws specifically, but in other jurisdictions, they're also very insidious in their actual penal codes. So in some countries, it's a crime to loiter. It's a crime to be street vendors and traders. And what we've seen and it really does target people who are of poor socioeconomic classes, and it's used by the police and criminal officials to actually for nefarious purposes, as we also see here in South Africa. And so over the past, I would say 10 years, what we've really seen on the continent is an adoption and a movement away and an encouragement to countries to move away and to decriminalize any laws that affect people purely because of their poverty and status. So what we've seen is the African Commission on Human and People's Rights have come up with a guiding document to states on decriminalization of petty offenses in Africa. There's even been an advisory opinion from the African Court on Human and People's Rights. And then in various jurisdictions, you've seen, again, court cases that challenge these specific laws that attack people and discriminate against people because they're poor and marginalized. And it's really, again, we find disproportionately it's targeting people, Black women. So, for example, these in Sierra Leone, there was a series of cases at the ECOWAS Court of Justice that challenged loitering laws in Sierra Leone that were not discriminatory on the face of it, but what they did was they would target sex workers specifically who were out at night, and they wouldn't arrest them necessarily for sex work, but they would arrest them for loitering at night using these loitering laws. And there's been a successful movement across the continent where these types of laws have been challenged. So it's really something that we in South Africa can learn from. Next slide. So moving on to issues of looking at decriminalization of drug use and sex work specifically, we've seen our courts have really started started the conversations around decriminalization of drug use, but again, in a very, very limited capacity. I think a lot of people are very familiar with the Prince case, which decriminalized private use, possession, and cultivation of cannabis by adults. But again, the court very much limited its arguments to saying that we decriminalizing drug use because it's about because the criminalization of it is an unjustifiable limitation on your right to privacy. So what you do behind closed doors isn't for anyone else's concern. But if you're going to be doing it behind closed doors or growing it behind closed doors, it's the parliament must still find a way to regulate it. And then we saw a further case that looked at the criminalization of cannabis possession, use and possession by children. And again, then taking a very paternalistic approach, looking at the vulnerability of children, saying that criminalization negates the inherent vulnerability of children. Poor children, are being affected by the criminal system, and so they should be protected by it. And so while we see that movement happening around cannabis, we can try and think of ways to extend it towards other vulnerable groups affected by drug criminalization. But what we really need to think about is the other constitutional rights that would protect decriminalization of drug use. So, for example, the right to dignity, your right to health, and that's something that the courts haven't really wanted to grapple with. So, and so when we are thinking of these questions, we really need to think of when we're talking about the criminalization of drug use, what constitutional rights are really offended. And also, on top of that, we need to think about why the criminal law is not the correct use of dealing with certain issues, especially around personal drug use or drug use more broadly. Next slide. I think that, again, these slides are available afterwards, but beyond just your legal arguments, when we're having conversations around decriminalization, we need to look at other considerations. We need to look at how our law and policy aligns to what is happening globally. And also we need to examine why criminalization is still used as a last resort proposed if we are making the argument that it's not the most effective tool to be used. Going into the issue of decriminalization of sex work, I think the one thing I wanted to spotlight, because a lot of it has been covered by my previous colleague who was speaking on the issue, is that there's currently the case before the Western Cape High Court, and part one where is going to be heard, where all parties seeking to intervene in this matter will be heard on the 1st and 2nd of September. And I think what is amazing about this interventions that's currently happening is that it has drawn in members across the board, and parties across the board working on sex work who really want to input into issues around decriminalization. So you have a variety of actors who want to intervene as amici curiae, who want to assist the court in the ultimate consideration around decriminalization of sex work. And I've just listed the names there of the parties seeking to intervene, and you'll see that you have various UN bodies in there, various NGOs, you have the South African Human Rights Commission, and within that cohort of people seeking to intervene, everyone has so different views on this. So it will be interesting to see how the court decides. Again, this has been repeated a lot by what my colleague before me said about what are the real drivers for decriminalization of sex work in South Africa. And we know that criminalization has actually had the opposite effect of what is its purported intention. It's actually increased human rights violations perpetrated against sex work. It's led to poor healthcare being accessible for sex workers, for unaffirming care, for queer and trans sex workers, services being unavailable. And then again, the actual laws that are criminalizing sex work actually act in the opposite direction in terms of being doing more harm than good than what they are intended. And they don't actually address the problems that they say they're seeking to address, such as human trafficking, because there's still, by keeping things criminalized, you leave room open to more exploitation. And what I've done here at the end is really looking at, if we're going to look at the question of decriminalization and we want to have a more right-centric approach towards decriminalization broadly, we really need to look at a variety of factors. So it's not about just the court cases or just the parliamentary hearings or just the public health considerations. It's about how all of these work together in an ecosystem. And I think to draw on a point that Yolan said previously, it means more conversations like this, and more conversations like this that are intersectoral with getting governments in the room to say why criminalization is still used, and making sure that all of our efforts towards decriminalization broadly actually speak to each other, to be looking more towards a human rights centric perspective around that. I think I'll stop there, and happy to share my presentation and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nabila. Nabila, we have run out of time a little bit through no fault of your own. It was gremlins on our winter Cape Town side. So apologies for that. But just to highlight, there aren't that many particular questions, but there is a really critical point that is mentioned by one individual around what does this really mean for CBOs and grassroots movements working in the human rights response in terms of our emergence, in terms of our response to decriminalization, our response to the criminal elements within the justice system, our response to municipal policing, our response to human trafficking issues. You mentioned some work that's been done around, applicants as well as strategic litigation, etc. What are we, supposed to be doing as civil society when this really does affect all of us, How do we infiltrate, in other words?
I think, what you have done here is actually a good point, and it's what movements like Sisonke and Swek try to do to give the grassroots and CBOs the voice. So it's for organizations such as ours at Lawyers for Human Rights to really facilitate opportunities for CBOs and grassroots organizations to make their voices heard at Parliament, to make to be able to provide them with a platform to be represented in cases. I think why I showed the fact that 16 amici curiae intervened in the sex work case. It's that there's 16 groupings that want to join to give their voice, but still their voice is missing. And so in the 2002 sex work case, there weren't many voices present that were seeking to assist the court. Now you have 16, but even then, there are so many voices that are not heard. So it's about organizations being able to use our privilege to be able to facilitate people who are working on the grassroots levels. So for example, what we do at LHR, one of the initiatives that we've run is to really do engagements with communities on how to do public submissions to Parliament when opportunities arise. And so in one instance, we just did a 2-hour session with communities that led to them being able to write something out, take a picture of it, and email the submission directly to Parliament. It's small things like that that you can do, that you don't need a lawyer with fancy language to do. You can do it yourself because you're very much entitled to as an active participant in society.
And just to remember, true change in this country happened because of grassroots, because of community-based organizations. You're absolutely correct. Nabila, it's an absolute pleasure to have you present. We will share your presentation with attendees. And I think what we have all, as NACOSA, as the previous PR principal recipient for sex work program in previous grant cycles, and as the principal recipient for the People Who Use Drugs program, we will, clearly partner with others in this attendees, as well as with Lawyers for Human Rights, around, around the decriminalization of sex work and for drugs for personal use. So thank you again for your voice and for the movements that you have made as Lawyers for Human Rights. Colleagues, you will see on your screen right now is a poll that we mentioned earlier about your opinions around, do you support the full decriminalization of sex work in South Africa? What is your main reason for the support? As well as, what is your support for full all drugs being decriminalized, and what should be the government approach to drug use in this country? So if you look to your screen right now, you will note a webinar poll of 4 questions, and we ask that you please, select the options on that poll, and we will then move forward to concluding. We have gone over time, so I thank you for your patience, but we do want to encourage you to register if you have not already for the next Amaqhawekazi Harm Reduction webinar, which will be on the gender-based violence conversation, the crisis for the lesbian and women who use drugs communities, getting their perspective of how we have failed them and where are the opportunities to eradicate gender-based violence for those women who use drugs, as well as the lesbian community, if not all female population. Once again, a warm thank you to our speakers. We had Nabila Meyer from Lawyers for Human Rights, Zintle Solwana from Sisonke, Charity Monoreng from Students for Sensible Drug Policy, as well as Isabel Pereira from Jujusa. And we would like to appreciate the inputs that they have done. We also like to thank our translators from Happy Clouds for the sign language translation and French translation, our technical team from Stratactive, as well as, just a warm appreciation for the support from the VIV Healthcare Positive Action Program grant for making these webinars possible. And we hope to continue the conversation as soon as possible. Thank you all to you all, and keep safe and raise your voices for decriminalization. It is for public safety, but also we have the right to autonomy, and it should be respected as a constitutional right. Thank you so much. Keep well, everyone.